In May 1940, as German formations advanced through Belgium and northern France, the image of the British soldier carried by the Wehrmacht was already fixed long before the first shots were exchanged. It had been shaped during the interwar years by German military journals, training lectures, and reinforced by propaganda that depicted Britain as an aging imperial power whose society had lost the capacity for sustained sacrifice. British troops were described as technically competent but psychologically brittle, dependent on naval protection and colonial manpower, inclined to withdraw once maneuver space collapsed. For many German soldiers crossing the Meuse, this perception was not an assumption but a certainty, embedded so deeply that it rarely appeared explicitly in diaries or letters because it seemed self-evident. The first encounters in France began to introduce inconsistencies that German observers struggled to explain. Reports from infantry divisions advancing toward the Channel describe British units conducting withdrawals under pressure with notable internal order, maintaining spacing, fire discipline, and command cohesion even when Luftwaffe attacks disrupted roads and rear areas. Letters written in late May record irritation rather than alarm. British troops were retreating but not dissolving, and prisoners taken during these actions often appeared calm, physically exhausted but orderly, still under clear officer control. These observations did not yet challenge the overarching belief in British weakness, but they complicated it. The experience around Dunkirk forced a sharper confrontation with reality. German artillery observers and forward infantry units watched British formations compressed into a shrinking perimeter that doctrine suggested should trigger mass surrender. Instead, German after-action reports repeatedly note disciplined rearguard actions, systematic destruction of equipment, and deliberate delay tactics executed by units whose chances of evacuation were visibly uncertain. War diaries from Army Corps engaged on the perimeter describe British troops holding positions longer than tactically efficient, not in desperation, but in apparent adherence to orders that prioritized time over survival. What unsettled German observers was not British courage, a category rarely emphasized in contemporary reports, but British predictability under extreme pressure. Units continued to function according to recognizable procedures even when operational logic pointed toward collapse. Several German letters remark on the refusal of isolated British groups to surrender despite encirclement, forcing repeated assaults and careful reconnaissance instead of rapid overruns. This behavior did not fit the pre-war model of a demoralized enemy seeking escape at the first opportunity. By the end of the evacuation, German soldiers had not revised their judgment of Britain as an opponent, but a dissonance had been introduced. The British soldier encountered in France did not behave as expected under defeat. That contradiction, noted quietly and without interpretation, would resurface in later campaigns, where it could no longer be dismissed as an anomaly of circumstance. In the days that followed the closure of the Channel coast, German formations began to encounter a pattern of resistance that no longer fit the category of temporary disorder or local misjudgment. The fighting at Calais confronted German commanders with British units that continued to fight under conditions in which surrender was not only expected but doctrinally assumed. German operational reports describe British garrisons fully aware that evacuation was improbable, yet maintaining structured defensive systems, rotating infantry within strongpoints, conserving ammunition, and coordinating artillery and anti-tank fire with a level of discipline that forced deliberate reduction rather than rapid penetration. The resistance did not alter the strategic outcome, but it consumed time, artillery ammunition, and attention that German planners had allocated elsewhere. Similar observations appear in German correspondence following the clashes near Arras, where British armored and infantry elements launched limited counterattacks against advancing German forces. German after-action summaries describe these actions as tactically contained yet operationally disruptive, not because of their scale, but because they contradicted the assumption that British units would disengage once initiative was lost. Letters from junior officers emphasized the confusion created by British formations advancing into contact rather than retreating, forcing German units to deploy cautiously and reassess intelligence estimates that had assumed minimal resistance once the front fractured. Along the Dunkirk perimeter, German divisional diaries increasingly record frustration with British rearguards that fought without visible concern for withdrawal routes. Units assigned to hold villages, canals, and road junctions resisted until forced out by direct assault, often withdrawing only when positions became untenable rather than when encirclement was complete. German soldiers noted that British infantry continued to follow fire control procedures, maintained spacing under artillery bombardment, and preserved command hierarchy even as casualty rates rose. These behaviors compelled German commanders to abandon expectations of rapid collapse and commit additional forces to reduce positions that had been classified as secondary objectives. The tone of German correspondence during this phase begins to shift subtly. The language remains critical and dismissive of British operational outcomes, yet repeated references to unexpected delay and stubborn defense appear in reports that were not intended for propaganda consumption. The resistance was described as irritating rather than admirable, but the irritation itself signals a reassessment. British troops were no longer treated as a declining adversary incapable of disciplined action under pressure, but as a force whose behavior disrupted German tempo in ways that required explanation. By the time the last British formations evacuated or surrendered along the coast, German soldiers had begun to register a pattern that could not be dismissed as coincidence. British units, even when operationally defeated, continued to impose costs disproportionate to their situation. That recognition did not yet translate into respect, but it eroded certainty, setting the conditions for a deeper reassessment when German troops encountered the same enemy again under different circumstances.
The transfer of the war to North Africa altered the German perception of British forces not through sudden confrontation, but through prolonged exposure that stripped away the distortions of expectation. Unlike the compressed campaigns of 1940, the Desert War imposed repetition, visibility, and endurance, conditions under which behavior could be observed over months rather than hours. German reports from early encounters with the British Eighth Army emphasized the unfamiliarity of the environment, but they also began to register a growing distinction between the conduct of British soldiers in contact and the decisions issued from higher command levels. This separation appears repeatedly in field correspondence, operational summaries, and later in retrospective assessments, indicating a structural shift in German evaluation rather than an isolated opinion. The writings and dispatches of Erwin Rommel articulate this division with particular clarity. Rommel's notes from 1941 and 1942 consistently describe British infantry as reliable under fire, capable of constructing effective defensive positions with limited material, and notably resistant to psychological pressure once engaged. German unit diaries echo this assessment, noting that British troops held ground as ordered, absorbed artillery bombardment without immediate disintegration, and executed withdrawals in a controlled manner when commanded to do so. These observations were often accompanied by expressions of frustration rather than admiration, as British endurance complicated German attempts to achieve rapid operational decision. At the same time, German correspondents increasingly criticized British command methods, describing them as rigid, slow to exploit success, and overly dependent on formal procedure. Letters from officers in the Africa Corps contrast the steadiness of British soldiers in defensive action with what they perceived as hesitation at higher levels, a pattern that allowed German commanders to preserve confidence in their own operational approach while acknowledging the competence of the enemy at the tactical level. This distinction provided an explanatory framework that reconciled German respect for British discipline with continued belief in German superiority of maneuver and initiative. The desert intensified these perceptions by removing concealment and compressing combat into visible, measurable exchanges. Repeated clashes over the same ground allowed German soldiers to anticipate British behavior with increasing accuracy, noting consistency rather than unpredictability. British units reacted methodically, adhered closely to orders, and demonstrated a capacity to endure losses without rapid collapse, traits that German observers began to recognize as institutional rather than situational. By the end of the first desert campaigns, German assessments had shifted decisively. British soldiers were no longer treated as a marginal factor propped up by material advantage alone, but as disciplined participants in a system whose limitations lay primarily at the level of command rather than morale. This interpretation, once established, would shape German expectations in subsequent confrontations, where endurance rather than maneuver would define the contest.
The siege of Tobruk confronted German commanders with a situation in which doctrinal assumptions failed repeatedly under empirical observation. German operational planning treated the isolation of a fortified port as a decisive condition, one that historically produced surrender through exhaustion, loss of maneuver, and psychological erosion. In the case of Tobruk, German staff officers calculated the duration of resistance in days and then in weeks, adjusting timetables without fundamentally questioning the premise that collapse was inevitable. The persistence of the British garrison forced those calculations to be rewritten again and again, not because of unexpected reinforcements, but because of the sustained effectiveness of British defensive systems. German after-action reports from 1941 and 1942 reveal a growing analytical focus on British artillery coordination within the perimeter. Fire plans were described as disciplined and economical, with counter-battery responses triggered not by volume but by identifiable German preparations, suggesting effective observation and command integration. Infantry assault reports note that British units held trench systems and strongpoints under bombardment longer than anticipated, withdrawing only when positions were physically compromised rather than when isolation became evident. These behaviors conflicted directly with German expectations of morale-driven collapse and required a methodical reduction of defenses that consumed time, ammunition, and operational momentum. Particularly revealing are German assessments of British refusal to surrender, even when tactical logic favored capitulation. Reports describe defenders continuing resistance despite shortages, often reorganizing internally after bombardment rather than disintegrating. German commanders recorded frustration at repeated failures to produce decisive psychological shock, noting that British training appeared to emphasize endurance and positional defense over maneuver flexibility. This forced German units into costly frontal actions and extended siege conditions that negated advantages in tempo and initiative. The cumulative effect of these experiences was not admiration, but a reluctant acknowledgement that German doctrine underestimated the capacity of British forces to function under prolonged encirclement. Tobruk became a reference point in later German discussions, cited as evidence that British defensive warfare could not be resolved through expectation of surrender alone. The garrison's endurance exposed a structural weakness in German assumptions about morale and collapse, a weakness that would reappear wherever British forces were prepared to trade time for position. By the end of the siege, Tobruk had ceased to be viewed merely as a stubborn anomaly. It became a warning example embedded in German operational memory, indicating that British resistance, when organized defensively, required full and deliberate reduction rather than doctrinal shortcuts, a realization that would echo beyond the desert. The most revealing German assessments of British military effectiveness emerged not from the battlefield but from captivity, recorded without the knowledge of those who spoke. Beginning in 1942, senior German officers captured in North Africa and later in Europe were interned at Trent Park, a country estate north of London that appeared to function as a conventional prisoner of war facility. In reality, the site was part of a British intelligence operation in which conversations between captured generals were secretly recorded, transcribed, and analyzed.
These discussions, conducted privately and without any expectation of external scrutiny, provide the least filtered German judgments of the British Army available from the war. Within these conversations, British soldiers were discussed in terms markedly different from those found in wartime propaganda or formal reports. German generals repeatedly described British troops as professionally reliable, particularly in defense, noting their ability to hold ground under heavy fire, maintain cohesion during withdrawals, and absorb losses without visible collapse. Several officers expressed surprise at the consistency of British unit behavior across different theaters, suggesting an institutional culture rather than situational competence. This reliability was contrasted with earlier assumptions that British forces lacked the psychological endurance for prolonged war, assumptions now openly dismissed in private speech. At the same time, criticism of British high command appeared frequently and with equal candor. German officers characterized British operational methods as cautious to the point of predictability, emphasizing methodical preparation, overwhelming firepower, and logistical security over rapid exploitation. Some conversations revealed genuine confusion at Britain's refusal to seek a negotiated settlement after 1940, with generals speculating that Britain's strength lay not in brilliance or daring, but in administrative depth and societal endurance. British logistics, in particular, were described as impressive, enabling sustained operations that German commanders acknowledged they could not match by the later stages of the war. What distinguishes the Trent Park material is its consistency. Independent conversations among officers of different services and commands repeatedly converge on similar conclusions, despite the absence of any coordinating influence. British soldiers were not admired in romantic terms, but they were respected as disciplined professionals whose behavior under fire could be relied upon. British leadership was criticized, sometimes sharply, but it was no longer dismissed as incompetent. The enemy had become intelligible, predictable, and therefore dangerous in a structural sense. These recordings mark a decisive endpoint in the evolution of German perception. The caricatures of 1940 no longer appear, replaced by sober evaluation grounded in accumulated experience. What remained unresolved was how this understanding would translate when German forces faced the British Army again on the main battlefield of Western Europe.
The German encounter with British forces in Normandy represented the final and most comprehensive test of the judgments formed since 1940. From the landings on D-Day through the attritional fighting in the Bocage, German soldiers and officers confronted a British army that bore little resemblance to the opponent they had expected 4 years earlier. German reports from June and July 1944 emphasize not surprise at British aggression, but the cumulative weight of British firepower, coordination, and persistence. British advances were described as deliberate and methodical, supported by artillery concentrations of a scale that left little room for improvisation, forcing German units into reactive defense rather than maneuver. Frontline accounts repeatedly note that British infantry advanced cautiously but consistently, integrating armor, engineers, and artillery in a manner that reduced exposure to sudden reversals. German veterans later contrasted this approach with the British Army of 1940, emphasizing not a change in character, but an expansion of capability. The discipline observed at Dunkirk and in North Africa now operated within a system of overwhelming material superiority, transforming endurance into strategic inevitability. German correspondence from Normandy highlights frustration at the inability to disrupt British tempo once an advance was initiated, as withdrawals were covered, positions consolidated, and pressure reapplied with minimal operational pause. Post-war memoirs and interviews by German veterans reveal a striking consistency in retrospective judgment.
British soldiers were described as dependable, resilient, and professionally trained, capable of sustained combat without the dramatic collapses anticipated by earlier doctrine. British leadership continued to be characterized as cautious and predictable, but this predictability was no longer framed as weakness. Instead, it was understood as a deliberate method that prioritized certainty over speed, trading surprise for reliability. Britain, in this view, did not defeat Germany through reckless daring or individual brilliance, but through organization, logistics, and the ability to endure a long war without institutional breakdown. By the late 1940s, the evolution of German perception had effectively concluded. The early contempt shaped by ideology and assumption had been eroded by repeated contradiction, replaced by a sober assessment grounded in experience. British soldiers were no longer underestimated, and British methods, though often criticized, were recognized as effective within their own logic. This final judgment, formed not in propaganda or post-war myth-making, but in diaries, reports, and unguarded conversations, reflects a rare convergence of enemy testimony. Britain endured, adapted, and prevailed, not by behaving unexpectedly, but by doing the same things relentlessly and at scale until resistance became untenable.